Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Australian Centre on China and the World, where we are hosting our annual CIW annual forum on China. And this year's theme is common prosperity and inequality in China. We've spent the last 2 days at a workshop where we've had a number of fantastic new research papers being presented, and we've invited some of the presenters from that workshop to speak tonight and to discuss this really important topic. My name is Ben Hillman. I'm the director of the Centre, and I'll be your host this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge, celebrate, and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of the Canberra region, and to all First Nation Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and work. I also pay my respect to their elders, past and present. I'd like to start by introducing the high-powered panel that we've assembled for you all this evening, starting with Jane. Jane Golly is an economist and head of the Arndt Corden Department of Economics, the Crawford School of Public Policy here at the ANU. And her interdisciplinary research centres around the Chinese economy with a focus on demographic change, child nutrition, and gender inequality. Scott Rozelle, on my left, holds the Helen Farnsworth Endowed Professorship at Stanford University and is Senior Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Currently, his work on economics of poverty reduction has its focus on human capital, including issues of rural health, nutrition, and education. On the far right, your far left, Andrew Walder, Professor of Sociology at Stanford University, where he's also Senior Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Professor Walder's current work is on China's economic and political trajectory since the end of the Mao era, with a focus on the corporate sector. Guanghua Wan, welcome, is Deputy Dean, Institute of Chinese Modernization and Development, Nankai University in China. Previously, he was director at the Institute of World Economy at Fudan University in Shanghai. Before returning to China, he spent a decade at the Asian Development Bank as research director and head of the Poverty Inequality Group. And on your far right, Christine Wong, visiting research professor at the East Asia Institute, National University of Singapore. Her research expertise is on China's public finance, with a focus on intergovernmental fiscal relations and their implications for governance, economic development, and social welfare. So please join me in welcoming these eminent speakers to CIW. Now, I've prepared a list of the most difficult questions I could think of for the panel, and we have an hour this evening, or a better part of an hour, and if we can get through all of these tough questions that I've prepared, we will open it up to the audience for some Q&A. First of all, Professor Wan, common prosperity, gongtong fuyu. This term has been used by generations of Chinese leaders to emphasize the ultimate goal of economic policy making, the importance of sharing economic benefits more widely. The proposed policies for achieving common prosperity have changed a lot over the decades in China. So what does the term mean today in its most recent iteration by Xi Jinping?
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thanks for this opportunity. May simply put this common prosperity as we understand it's making and sharing a cake or cakes, right? And you are right, it wasn't studied now. It goes back 50, 60 years in China, but only in 2021, they actually made a national campaign. Or whether if you want to assess the prospect of common prosperity, whether to what extent we're successful, I mean, there's an English saying is that, so, can you have the cake and you eat it too? That's what I found from the website. But from my point of view, there are a couple of questions we got to face. One is what cake, right? I mean, you can talk about economics, GDP, income, consumption, and we know they mean different things. That's not clearly defined in China, but generally they want to, share the cake, whatever cake it is, share more equally, right? The second point is I want to emphasize is China's common prosperity is just not one cake. They actually talk about 5 different cakes. I mean, I don't know whether I want to go through. One is material, which we all understand, whether economics, GDP, consumption, or income. Second is they're called spiritual dimension, which very difficult for me to understand, to compare. The third, environmental thing, we understand. We've got to make the environment better and share better, And third is the social dimension. To me, it's generally means safety, order, and so on. The final point is public goods provision. Final point I want to make is this: making a cake and sharing the cake, the two things of the same concept, are interrelated to each other. How, it's really inequality and growth. It's a topic economics done a lot of work, myself included. And that's bringing me to the final thing. Why China, they've been talking about this for decades and decades. All the leadership since the People's Republic founded in 1949. Why in 2021 made, a national strategy? It's related to China's growth prospect. That's something I'm going to talk about on the 26th. So that's, I'm not going to elaborate. Simply put, China has grown quite dramatically. We all know that. But inequality has grown also quite dramatically. And this inequality affects consumption. I mean, we have many rich, but they don't consume that much. You have a lot of poor, 200 million living under about 5,000 Chinese. A year means $1,000 a year, right? And so they cannot afford to consume. And that's where the hoarding, that's most constraining concern right now with this political turmoil happening in China. And that's why in 2020, you all know, well, some of you will know China launched another campaign called dual circulation. Basically, it's, in the past, we rely on the international market. But from now on, we got more. We still want the international market, but we want more emphasis on the domestic market. Domestic got to consume more, but well, inequality comes in. So after a year, there was little impact. Even today, very little impact on consumption. So 2021, someone said, we got to really make it serious, not just rhetoric, make it serious. Common prosperity campaign. Let me stop here.
Okay, thanks. So common prosperity, the common prosperity agenda is broader than income, economic inequality. But I think we're going to zero down in our conversation tonight on issues of economic and income equality. We're also going to touch on some other dimensions of inequality. But it's clear that from what you're saying, that this is something that is really significant for China's future economic growth, but also social and political stability. I think we can agree on that. I'm going to go to Andrew Walder now, because when we think of China's system, China's political system, its political economy, well, officially, it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. And this is a debate we often have in our classes here at the university: is China socialist? What is socialism? Without going back over some of those debates, generally, I think we can agree that when we hear or when we think of socialism, we're inclined to think of a high degree of government spending, tax and transfer, a high degree of government spending on social welfare, on education, healthcare, public housing. Now, is that the case in China? Is that what socialism in China looks like? And how does China's government spending on these social policies, social programs, compare with other countries at similar levels of economic development?
Yeah, Barry Naughton wrote a paper, published it in 2017. The title was, "Is China Socialist?" And this is when I started thinking about this problem. And he pointed out that China has, compared to any other major economy, China controls much higher percentages of national wealth, financial and both non-financial resources. It has an effective centralized fiscal system, taxation system. It's able to extract resources fairly effectively from the economy. But it does very little redistribution of wealth. And so if you looked into this a little bit more, and China redistributes less in reducing its level of income inequality than even the United States or Russia, which are at similar levels of inequality now. And the reason is that really three things. One is the growth model is really intensively focused on capital formation, on investment. So China has extraordinary infrastructure, not just the railways, but all of the beautiful skyscrapers you see, even in third-level cities in China. But also China is still a middle-income country, but it's trying to compete with the United States in terms of military rivalry. And so it doesn't spend as much as the United States, but for a country at its level of GDP per capita, that's a pretty heavy burden. So I think that's one of the reasons. The other is the expenditures on internal security, which is a very high priority for the regime and has been more of a priority for the last 10 years. So, this is a very ambitious agenda, and for a country that still has a GDP per capita about 1/4 to 1/3 of the United States, if that's the goal, that's going to have some social costs.
Okay. Christine Wong, I'm going to turn to you now. China's social insurance system covers pensions, healthcare, unemployment, and work-related injury insurance, maternity, housing. Is a social safety net emerging in China? And will it be enough, do you think, to convince ordinary workers that they can spend more money on living rather than saving for future medical emergencies and their retirement?
Right. China actually has a universal social welfare system that covers everyone. There's healthcare that enrolls virtually all citizens. There's pension system, social pension, that covers everyone. It has a minimum income stipend scheme that says if your income falls below a certain minimum level specified by your local government, you will receive a subsidy to bring you up to that minimum income, right? And that sounds pretty good. The problem is that it's implemented very poorly and it's highly stratified. So these systems were built up, one piece at a time. And so on the healthcare, if you are in the public sector, if you're a civil servant or you work for a public institution like university, school, your healthcare costs are 100% covered. If you worked in the formal sector, state enterprises, or a large private corporation, you are covered quite well at a much higher level. But if you are outside of that formal system, if you're in the rural sector, or if you work in an informal job, then you have much, much more shallow coverage, right? And social pension, everyone is entitled to a pension when they retire, and the retirement ages are very, very low. 50 for women, 50 to 55, and 60 for men. Again, the public sector, civil servants receive on average 9,000 yuan a month. That's almost 2,000 Australian dollars.
Yeah, close to it. Yeah.
If you were a formal sector retiree, if you were in that system, you receive about 3,500 yuan per month. If you are outside of that, you're in the informal or rural sector, you receive 240 yuan a month. That's less than half of the poverty line that the government sets, which is already a very low poverty line, right? Even so, social costs are now taking up 41% of total government spending. Now, government spending is very complicated in China because its spending is spread out over 4 budgets. But when you add up the social security budget and the general budget, China is already spending 41% on social spending, even though, as Andy said, they're spending a lot on defense and public security and so on. The other problem is that China's tax mechanism is failing. The amount of tax revenues they are collecting has been falling since 2015, partly because growth has slowed, partly because the government thinks that when the economy slows down, they should give tax cuts. And so they keep cutting taxes. But also, there's a problem that their tax system is antiquated. They haven't changed it since the 1990s. And they are highly dependent on turnover taxes on goods production. Services are taxed at a very low rate. And as China, like everybody else, is shifting out of manufacturing into services, the government is capturing less and less taxes. They also, the biggest problem, and this is related to the lack of redistribution that Andy referred to, is that they don't make any use of the personal income tax. The personal income tax collects 1% of GDP in China and has remained at that level, over the last 40 years since it's been introduced. In fact, the tax administration just posted a notice this year that says if you earn less than 10,000 yuan a month, which is about almost two times the average income, you don't have to file an income tax return. There's no tax on you because they have a very high threshold. So in Australia, if you earn 2.2 times the average income, you're at the highest marginal rate. In the UK, 1 out of 6 taxpayers is paying the highest marginal rate. In China, you have to earn about 24 times average income to reach the highest rate of 45%. So only about 10% of the population pays an income tax. And of those who file income taxes, more than 60% are paying at the marginal rate of 3%. So they're obviously not redistributing income from high income to low income. And the income tax is also very narrow. It only taxes salaries and wages and royalty incomes. Capital gains are taxed separately at 20% fixed rate, and much capital gains is exempted, so that the incomes that accrue to wealthy people fall out of are outside the tax net. So China needs to find a way to collect enough money to meet its growing needs. The OECD shows that, among the rich countries, the public sector keeps drifting up in size over time, regardless of the political changes in the administration, because of this growing need for social services, led by pensions and healthcare. These costs have been rising because, in the rich country, we're all aging, and healthcare is more expensive for the elderly, and we've had medical advances that are costing more and more. Right? And Japan, if you look at Japan and Korea, they're already spending 60% of their government spending on social services. China is at 41%, and the curve is very steep.
I've got another question for you, so I might leave that one there. Thinking about China's taxation system, it really does, coming back to this question about how we categorize China's political economy, socialism with Chinese characteristics has a tax system that would be the envy of conservative parties all around the world. There's no inheritance tax, no property tax. It's a tax system that really benefits the rich. We'll leave that debate aside for now. Coming back to the question, the broader question of inequality, one of the key dimensions is regional. So China's a middle-income country, I think around 12,000 US dollars per capita, but that masks really high discrepancies between, say, Beijing and Shanghai, which have, almost advanced country, high-income country, per capita incomes 30,000 plus, whereas there are, several provinces that have GDP per capita below $10,000. So regional inequality, well understood, known problem in China. How are policymakers working to address the regional income inequality, and is the fiscal system working to do that?
The central government has been putting a lot of effort into equalizing across provinces. So China has 31 provincial units, and they try to do what they can, and it's been improving. So Henan, the poorest province in per capita terms, in fiscal terms, has been receiving on a per capita basis more and more transfers from the central government. But it's not nearly enough. Because of the fiscal problems I talked about earlier, the central government has been, so tax revenues are shared between central and local governments, roughly 50-50. The central government since 2020 has been giving back 100% of all it collects to local governments in transfers. And even so, local governments do not have enough money to spend. So central government is on deficit spending, local governments are all on deficit spending. And the overall fiscal deficit has grown from 2% of GDP in 2015 to 9% of GDP this year. And when you're short of money, it's very hard to talk about improving your transfers or boosting your social spending and so on.
A big part of the inequality story in China is regional, but specifically it's also urban. There's a major urban-rural divide in incomes. In fact, the urban-rural divide in China is one of the largest in the world. Scott Rozelle, this question's for you. Has the Xi administration's emphasis on common prosperity and success in eradicating abject poverty through the targeted poverty campaign, has this helped to reduce the urban-rural divide? And why not?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think building on what we just heard, what I often say is China has completely eliminated poverty. There are no poor people, but there happens to be 900 million low-income people. And in fact, even their premier, who passed away, former premier, just passed away 2 years ago, he actually made a public announcement that said China had 900 million people that make less than $10 a day, right? And so it's very, very low. And this was after the big poverty campaign. And it's something that's really, really fundamental there. And we've heard a couple times about China has grown over time. It's slowing down now, but there's also been very high levels of inequality. So are these low-income people unhappy, right? What do they think about their country? Marty White sitting here in the front row. Marty is a sociologist and studied this rise of income and rise of inequality question for a number of years, wrote many papers in a very influential book called The Myth of the Social Volcano. So the myth of the social volcano is there's such high rising inequality, people must they're going to be a blow up of social unrest. And then he went out in 2004, 2009, 2014, and interviewed all the people, from rich people to poor people. And the poor people.
Not personally.
Yes. I think there were 20,000 people that he and his team interviewed over this time. And basically what they found is people said, yes, I know I'm poor. Yes, I know there's high inequality, but I'm better off today than I was 5 years ago. And I think I'll be better off 5 years from now than I am today. And so that's the myth of the social. So there
That's
wasn't
good.
that.
Yeah.
So we get through COVID. China's economy is slowing. I'm a big fan of these papers of Marty, and I say, hey, it's been 10 years since Marty did this. Let's go out and ask people again. So we redid the survey in 2023, and the paper basically is the change in China from optimism to pessimism. And what we found was there was this very, very distinct shift where people said, no, I don't think I'm going to be better off 5 years from now. That they, so of course, the news media jumps on us and say, well, is there going to be the rise of the volcano now? But what we did find was people were still saying, but I'm going to work hard and I'm going to try to move forward. And it's things, I hope things are going to get better. So what's going to be really interesting over the next several years is what's going to happen to China's growth. If it continues to stagnate or even fall, are we going to see a rumbling of the ground, right? There's no social volcano out there now, but let's see what happens.
Thanks. Jane, I'm going to turn to you now. Chinese Communist Party rose to power as the vanguard of workers and peasants. It's now a nationalist party that welcomes entrepreneurs and professionals into its ranks. How are blue-collar, rural and urban, workers faring in China today? And what about youth unemployment, especially in urban China? How will their opportunities or lack of them shape income inequality trends in the future?
Thanks, Ben. That's a pretty small question. I've got a few numbers jotted down to help me along, unlike Christine reeling off those figures about percentages of expenditure and so on. It's a good starting point to not just distinguish between rural and urban, but to think, as the economists would, divide them up as to skilled and unskilled, even though I think that's an unfair distinction. I'm pretty sure a hairdresser is much more skilled than I am, for example, but we do classify them as these unskilled workers, or what you might otherwise call blue-collar workers. And I'm not really thinking about hairdressers in the Chinese context, but rather the many, many, mainly rural migrants, but also urban workers who have provided the labour that has financed or provided the labour for the labour-intensive manufacturing sectors concentrated in the coastal regions traditionally. It's spread out a little bit in addressing that regional question, but have basically done pretty well through the first 20 or 30 years of reform. And that process of economic development has led to their wages rising. Now, that in itself is not a bad thing, but of course there are a lot of headwinds now coming at them. The first one is that a process of industrial upgrading has meant that Chinese wages are too high. And they're no longer competitive. So we see a process of flying geese, as the economists put it, as those factories choose to relocate into other places where wages are lower and they can be paid less. So that is a threat to their employment status here. Add to that the advances in AI and robotics, just the shift towards higher technology. That plays out in complicated ways when none of us sure who they're going to replace. I heard Bill Gates say just recently that that teachers and doctors will be out of jobs, so they perhaps become part of the losers there. And the only people who will have jobs in the future are coders, people working in energy and biology. Now that remains to be seen, but the point still is that these less educated, predominantly rural workers are going to have a tough time in this world of industrial upgrading, and that's before you mention Trump's tariffs, which of course can affect sectors across the board. On youth unemployment, we need a little bit of good news in the mix. This is where I looked up my numbers. You all will have heard about the youth unemployment crisis in China, one of the many crises we read about pretty much daily in the press here. Just that in 2024, and this is CIA data, it won't be accurate. The Chinese government will not be reporting accurately what the numbers are. But China reported a youth unemployment rate of 15% in 2024. That ranked it 79th in the world, noting that Australia had 9% youth unemployment, so not too far off there, compared with the highest unemployment rates of above 70% in Djibouti and South Africa, but also really high figures that were surprising to me in the 50-60% range. This is for youth 15 to 24-year-olds looking for a job. Now, a lot of them fall into the unskilled category that we're talking about, but the other side of the coin there are the educated Chinese who, despite industrial upgrading, it's as though they've become educated more quickly than the industrial upgrading can take place.
Right.
And so you've got this excess of students coming out of universities who are unable to find jobs even in those high-tech sectors. And of course, that is compounded by Trump's tech wars against China, quite specifically trying to hold back those sectors. So there's a bit of a double whammy happening at both ends of the spectrum. Indeed. How it plays out for inequality between the two, that's going to take a lot more number crunching to put a fine point on it.
Yeah. Jan, I'm going to come back to you afterwards because I want to hear more about, and I want the audience to hear more about your insights on gender inequality. But I just want to stick with the industrial upgrading, urban jobs. I'm going to come back to you, Guanghua, on urbanization, because urbanization has been one of the driving forces of China's rapid economic growth and poverty alleviation, but it has also contributed to regional inequality as wealth has accumulated, particularly on the East Coast in those urban centres. Is there a way of managing urbanization? And I know there are lots of policy debates about this in China, but is there a way of managing it so that it can contribute to the common prosperity sharing of the cake agenda?
Well, I guess partly, you raised that question because partly I published on this issue. But
that's why I'm asking you.
But I could tell you that I used to work on inequality and income distribution, but suddenly one day I was sitting in a flight from Kunming back to Fudan. I look at the paper I published. See, if you look at China's inequality, right, it's rising, it's pretty high. But if you do a breakdown into three parts, inequality within urban, within rural, and between urban and rural, into three parts, you do a simple accounting. Earlier, it can account for 50-60% of total China's inequality. Nowadays, it's dropped somehow, but it's still a very significant part. So while sitting in the flight, I said, my God, what are we going to do? Traditional view in economics is transfers, government policies. But I said that's impossible because, you have a large chunk of, more than 60%, more than 70% of people living in rural China, which are poor, 30% living in urban areas. That time they're not rich. They are managing. So you can't really do this. Then suddenly I said, urbanization. So since then, I've been saying actually, in 2008 June, when I did a meeting in New York in the United Nations, the Chinese radio interviewed me. I actually proposed urbanization. That time was the only way to solve China's poverty and inequality problems. Because very simple, I don't have to go through that. My sister, okay, I'm from Jiangsu, not far from Shanghai. I was in Shanghai still in January. I just moved to Nanking, in April. My sister back in Jiangsu, my friend gave her a job and 1,000 yuan, which is $200 a month, which is not too bad. So one day I got a call from her. She said, "Hey, brother, I'm in Shanghai, pretty far from me. It's so big. It takes her 2.5 hours to get to me." I said, "What? What do you? How you? Coming to this?" She said, "Oh, my friend introduced me a job, and I get about 5,000. Not much, but it's 5 times what I get in China. Nothing changes, and they provide accommodation. Not very nice. So." That's the power of urbanization, isn't it? And reducing inequality. Because we know poverty in any country, developing countries, 80% in rural areas, like my sister. And when nothing changes, you move to the urban areas because productivity is higher, lot different reasons, that reduce contrast, make it much, much smaller. So since then, it was highly debatable in China. You can say in many different, even today, Chen Shiwen, who is the number 1 in China's agricultural policy, we still have different views on that. And he still want to give up. Many people agreed with me now, urbanization is a way to go for developing countries, China in particular, to help reduce inequality. It may not completely solve it, but it's still debatable right in China. But I'm still holding that view 20 years down.
So the urbanization story and the urban-rural divide in China, this is something that remains institutionalized by the the Hukou system, household registration. And this limits the access that rural migrant workers have to urban services, education, health, which creates an underclass of migrant workers. So the urban-rural divide plays out within cities as an underclass of migrant workers who don't have the same rights. Scott Rozelle, I'm going to turn to you now. There's been so much debate about the inequalities of the Hukou system and the need to reform it. But nothing much has really happened. Why hasn't there been any progress in addressing what is, one of the most obvious structural inequalities in contemporary China?
Beijing is for Beijingers and Shanghai is for Shanghaiers, and it's not for the people from outside there. Is the constituents of the leaders who decide that who can move there. And this is the big problem with big cities now. So I'm going to talk about the problem in big cities. But there has been some improvement, and let me just go quickly through it. So if you're a rural person from a rural area, and 60% of the people have this rural identity card. I used to tell my students, I go, when you're born in China, they tattoo urban or rural right here, and they go, "Really?" I go, "No," but you get an identity card that says rural or urban, and it if you're from a rural area, you go to a big city, you can't put your kids in school, you can't go to the hospital and get reimbursed. You can't, and so this is a big change. You can go get a job, but you can't buy a house or an apartment. You have to rent a place, or you live in a dormitory, et cetera, et cetera. These are the big cities, and that it's the underclass, which Ben just talked about. Now, there's been a big debate over we have to address this question, right? And that urbanization is important. And what we've seen is there's been a change. There's time's up. Time's up. Time for our wine. There's been a change in third, fourth, and fifth tier cities. So. Is Canberra
first tier?
Third tier, a third tier city. Come on. Yeah, I got it. No, so, and in these and there are probably 2,000 of these cities. There's 2,800 counties in China, and there's 2,000 of them are third, fourth, and fifth tier cities. They have between 15,000 and 50,000 people in them, but the county has 200,000 people, so 75% rural. Okay, so here we are, and what they're now doing is saying, okay, let's let these rural people, we're not going to let them move to Shanghai, Beijing, Melbourne, Sydney, or Canberra. We're gonna let them move to their county seat. So we're going to get rid of the urban and rural Hukou. We're going to call you from Ping An County, and you can now move into the city. We want you to move in the city. Now, there's some side incentive for local leaders to do that. There's a property crisis out in China now. They've overbuilt all these things, and so if you want your kid to come to the school in the county seat, which is much better than the school out in the rural area, you have to buy an apartment or you have to rent an apartment. And so it's addressing this, number one. Number two is the number of kids in China have gone down. And so the schools in these local communities have lots of open classrooms and teachers that are going to have to be laid off. We want to keep our urban teachers. And so they've been encouraging people to move in to these towns. I think this is good. Okay? I think this is a positive change. The problem is people are spending all their money buying an apartment or renting an apartment, settling in here. They're getting their kids better educated. That's all good. They got better health care in there versus their village doctor. The problem becomes, the problem becomes, what are they going to be doing 20 years from now? The goal that some people have talked about has had these 2,000 counties. These are like the small little counties in Australia or the small little counties in the Midwest of the U.S. They want 2,000 counties with 200,000 people each in them. That's 400 million people, right? But almost all those people, remember 900 million people are low income. Almost all those people are low income, okay? So now you don't have manufacturing, you don't have construction, and people low income don't buy services, or they buy low levels of services. What's the long term? I mean, and so I think that we see these changes, and there's really struggling with it. The last thing I'm going to say is what in the 1990s and 2000s, what I used to always say was China needs to build one city from Shenyang, it's like Brisbane, and have that city go all the way down to Melbourne and across to Adelaide, right? And let 90%, no, I actually said 60% of Australia should move to that city. You guys.
That's pretty much what we do.
But I wanted 700 million people to live in this one city that's along the coastal area, and of course they said no way, right? And China isn't into urbanization, and it's going to be a huge issue as they try to move forward of how they do that.
Okay. Scott, I'm just going to stay with you, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I would like you to say a couple of things about your research on early childhood education, because this is something you've done a lot of work on and you pay special attention to. Why do you think early childhood education matters so much for the inequality, common prosperity story we're talking about?
I'll try to be very quick here.
Yeah.
So if you look at all the countries in the world, and you look at income today, income 70 years ago, you got poor countries out in Africa. You got rich countries, right? The Australias, New Zealands, Canadas, Frances up here. There's two types of countries in the world. There are those that are stuck in the middle income trap, the Mexicos, Brazils, and Argentinas and Turkeys and South Africas. And then there's the graduates. Okay, there's the graduates up here, and that's Taiwan, South Korea, Ireland, Israel. It's a handful of them. There aren't very many of them. And you look at what is different of these guys than of the ones who have been stuck in middle income for the last 70 years? And it's their level of education of the entire labor force. And these countries, when they were middle income, South Korea and Taiwan and in Ireland, that 70 to 80% of their labor force had already, their whole labor force, all the way up to 60 years old, had gone to high school or above. So they knew math and science and language, and they could do white collar technical jobs, right, in the high income economy, which is, that's what high income economies do. While the Mexico, South Africas, and Turkeys, basically 70 to 80% of their labor force had never been to one day of high school. They didn't know math, they didn't know science. Okay, so where's China in all this? If you compare China's labor force to the labor forces of all the other upper middle income countries in the world, the Brazils, the Colombias, the Ireland, not the Ireland, sorry, the South Africas, is China has the lowest educated labor force in the whole upper middle income world. Number one low. Okay. Only in 2015, the last census that was available, only 30% of China's entire labor force, 900 million people, 560 million people had never been to one day of high school. 560 million people. Okay, so how do we get everybody to high school for the last 15 years? Let's give them better high school education. They can't learn. Let's give them junior high education. We can't learn. Let's get the elementary schools better. They don't learn. And guess what? It's what the whole world is now thinking about is maybe the problem is starting at 0 to 3. And what we've been doing is the work that's started by Jim Heckman, an economist in the University of Chicago, that basically says to get your labor force up in these middle-income countries, you have to get parents to raise their babies from 0 to 3. Because as China has a saying, at 3 you see the future. Your IQ, your cognitive, your language skills, and your social emotional skills are set at 3. And so Chinese babies from rural, so 70% of babies are rural. 50% of those babies are delayed when they're 3. If you send them to high school, they can't learn. And that this is a huge thing. This is the exact same problem that happened in Brazil, the exact same problem that happened in Mexico. That we have fantastic schools in Mexico. This was in the 1990s. Nobody could go. And so it's a complicated issue, but the world is really trying to deal with that. And the Chinese are struggling with it now because it's expensive to try to implement this, and as we've heard here, it's hard to get the resources.
Thanks. And folks, we're covering a lot of ground in the hour that we have, but all of the people speaking tonight have been doing a lot of research over many years on all of these topics. So if you want to find out more about any of these, all you need to do is Google them and look up some of their papers. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to come back to a really important dimension of inequality, and that's gender. Jane, can you, in the short time that we have, can you give us a couple of observations, a couple of insights into gender inequality in China? Is the gap closing? How are women workers, well, let's just focus on the income divides for now, if we can. How are women workers doing okay? How are they doing in China today?
Well, one piece of good news is that women do actually out-educate men, although still in rural areas you'll often see the girls suffering in those early childhood years that Scott's talking about. So there's some good news, women. They're doing better on the education front. But in terms of income, I'm afraid it's utterly dire. The Global Gender Gap Ranking for 2025 came out just a couple of weeks ago, and China ranked 103rd out of, I think, 149 countries. So that compares with Australia at 13 that we were celebrating. It is better than Japan at 118, but it's on a par, with a bunch of other countries, and it could definitely do better. There is immense discrimination in the labour market. You hear anecdotal stories. Just listening to a Chinese podcast the other day talking about women going for job interviews and being asked the question, do you have a partner? Are you married? When are you having children? I was so glad to hear Scott say talk about parents raising their children and not assuming that it would be the woman, whilst on the other hand, Xi Jinping is trying to promote a marriage and childbearing culture that has the women at home specifically. We know that that brings a motherhood penalty, witnessed in the simple question of, will you have a child, and if so, I won't employ you. But that gender gap plays out, in a really significant way. I'm still going to call the urban-rural divide the biggest travesty, and I think the biggest failing of the Chinese Communist Party to talk about socialism and leave it in that state, not just for inequality's sake, but the implications for China's future growth. I think I'm going to put urban-rural inequalities once, but I'm just going to have one more punch for gender inequality. I was doing one of my papers, one of my favourite papers that opened up the gender research to me. I was trying to understand what explained inequality across the earnings distribution, and I assumed that the urban-rural divide would be the biggest factor. I stumbled on the fact that gender was more important for explaining the earnings distribution and the inequality in it than the urban-rural divide. So that's why I'm talking about it today. The pair of them, a disgrace. I really hope they can do better.
Okay, thanks, Jane. Zooming out, I've got one final question for the panel, and I'm going to come back to Andrew Walder on this. What are the future prospects for addressing inequality? And what are the trade-offs are going to be?
Well, we've already heard from Christine Wong about the rising demand for social expenditures and so forth. We'd be remiss if we didn't, as part of the future trajectory, we did not mention the rapidly aging population. Mm-hmm. And that's going to affect this in two different ways that are kind of scary. One is, as the population ages, there's going to be increased demand for healthcare and pension support, okay? But also that means there are fewer wage earners per household, which means that the dependency ratios are going up. So the famous household savings that have really helped families cope for the last several decades, those savings rates are going to be going down at a precipitous rate at the same time that the demand is going up. So you put this together with the story that Christine Wong told us about rising strains in the fiscal system and inequality in access to these benefits. I'm just glad I'm not in charge of China.
Yeah. Thanks. And also, I think what you highlight there is the significance of inequality, not just for China, but the ramifications of it for the rest of the world, because it's going to certainly, how China's policymakers govern and navigate this over the next few years is going to be impactful worldwide, especially for a place like Australia, which has such an important trading relationship with China.